Imagine a world where land was worth its weight in gold, a world where every inch of land was precious, and the ocean was not a gentle sea, but a formidable, unpredictable force. Imagine that you are running from something terrible, from barbarians whose names instilled terror. And you have nothing, no home, no future, only fear in your eyes and a swamp under your feet. That is how, almost 1,500 years ago, the history of Venice began. Not with greatness and wealth, but with despair and a search for salvation. Around 420 AD, the Huns arrived on the Apennine Peninsula. Led by Attila, they sowed death and destruction, burning cities and enslaving their inhabitants. The only salvation for many was flight, and so thousands of people, former citizens of the Roman Empire, left their homes and moved east, to the sea. They walked until they reached the edge of the earth, where the warm Adriatic turned into an impregnable swamp, where instead of solid soil, there was only mud, salt marshes, and tiny, barely noticeable islands. This inhospitable, harsh terrain seemed unsuitable for life, but it was precisely this that became their salvation. After all, the barbarians, accustomed to fighting on land, simply did not know how to fight nature. Here, in these swamps, the fugitives began to build their new lives. At first, they were just temporary shelters, rickety huts on small piles that barely stayed above the water. It did not look like a city. It looked like a desperate attempt to survive. But in the eyes of these people, who had lost everything, a spark of hope was born. A spark that would eventually flare up into a flame and create the most mysterious, the most incredible city in Europe. A city that, despite everything, was built not on land, but on water. A city that we know as Venice. This is not a story about kings and conquerors, but about ordinary people who believed in the impossible. This is a story about how from mud and water, a miracle can be born, which became one of the most beautiful creations of mankind. Let's immerse ourselves in this story, in its sounds, smells, and feelings. Imagine yourself on one of these islands, where the wind walks between the reeds and the water splashes on shaky platforms. There are no warm houses and stone roads, only hope and determination. They were the first to dare to challenge nature, the first to decide that a swamp could be not only a prison, but also a fortress. And this decision, taken in desperation, changed the course of history. They did not know that their children and grandchildren would live in a city that would become the commercial capital of the world, a center of art and beauty. They simply wanted to survive. And to make this dream come true, they had to figure out how to build not just a village, but a real city that would rise above the water. And this was only the first chapter of their incredible story. Who were these people who dared to challenge nature? They were not sailors or fishermen. They were former citizens of the Roman Empire, people accustomed to order, to straight roads and stone aqueducts. Their lives were built on solid ground, in cities with majestic temples, forums, and paved streets. And suddenly, in one night, they lost everything. Their world collapsed, crushed under the hooves of barbarian horses. In search of salvation, they came to the swampy islands called Rivo Alto, which means high shore. But there were no high shores there. There were only tiny patches of land, barely rising above the water. These people, accustomed to luxury and comfort, found themselves in a situation where they had to live in the most primitive conditions, where the only food was fish and the only home was a rickety reed hut. They were forced to learn new skills that would never have been useful in the cities. They learned to fish, to weave nets, to build boats. They observed nature, the ebb and flow of the tides, the life and breath of the lagoon. This forced isolation changed them. It made them resilient, resourceful, and, most importantly, united. It was here, in the mud and dampness, far from civilization, that they slowly began to transform into what we now call Venetians. From the Romans, they inherited a love of order and an ability to build, and from the lagoon, strength, flexibility, and incredible ingenuity. They no longer felt like fugitives. They became masters of their new land, albeit one made of water. They realized that to survive here, they needed to do more than just build a house. They needed to build a whole world that would rest on three pillars: faith in themselves, unity, and water, which became their main defense. And this realization became the starting point for creating one of the greatest miracles of human history. They started small, with primitive huts that they built right on the swampy ground, putting branches and stones under the walls. But spring floods and winter storms quickly destroyed these miserable shelters. The islands went underwater, and the houses were simply washed away. Every year they had to build everything anew. It was a vicious circle of despair, and many were ready to give up. But there were those among them who did not want to accept their fate. Those who saw water not as an enemy, but as a foundation. They noticed one amazing thing. Wooden piles driven into the silt became incredibly strong. This happened because there was no oxygen in the silt, and the wood simply did not rot. It turned to stone. And then a bold, crazy idea was born in their heads. What if you built a city not on land, but on water? What if the entire city stood on a huge forest foundation, hidden from view? The idea seemed unthinkable. To build a city that would rise above the swamps, supported by millions of wooden piles? It would require superhuman effort, huge amounts of wood, and, most importantly, faith that such a thing was possible. It was at this point that the refugees stopped being just fugitives. They became builders. They stopped just surviving and started creating. Not just a new home, but a new civilization that would challenge nature itself. And this dream, this crazy idea, became the first and most important brick in the foundation of the future majestic city. For years, the first settlers struggled with the lagoon. They built and the water destroyed. It seemed that the land did not want to accept them, and the swamp did not want to become home. But at some point, in the midst of despair, they made an observation that changed their fate forever. They noticed that the wooden posts they drove into the bottom did not rot. Unlike wood lying on the surface or buried in the ground, the posts, completely hidden in the mud and water, remained solid. It was a major discovery. It was not the result of scientific research or a complex experiment. It was a simple observation made in survival conditions. The Venetians realized
that oxygen was needed for decay, and there was virtually none in the dense silt of the Adriatic lagoon. In addition, seawater, saturated with salts and minerals, gradually soaked the wood, turning it into a kind of stone. This process, similar to petrification, made the wood incredibly strong, capable of withstanding enormous weight.
From that moment on, they stopped seeing water as their enemy. They realized that water could be their ally. The swamp, which had previously seemed like a curse, was now seen as a reliable, eternal foundation. They came up with the concept of the foundation city. It wasn't just an idea. It was a new philosophy of construction. Instead of trying to drain the swamp, they decided to use its properties. This discovery gave them hope, and more importantly, it gave them the tools to realize their dream. Now they had the knowledge to build a city that would not just sit on the swamps, but would become an integral part of them. Thus began a new era in the history of Venice, an era in which man and nature united to create something truly incredible. To realize this incredible dream, they needed a foundation that could support the weight of an entire city. And not just any foundation, but something that could withstand water and time. They tried different types of wood, but most of them rotted, crumbled to dust, unable to withstand constant contact with seawater. And then they turned their gaze north, towards the Alps. There, in the mountain forests, grew two special trees, oak and larch. It was a difficult choice, but a brilliant one. Oak, hard and powerful, was ideal for piles. Its wood, dense and heavy, could withstand enormous weight. But oak had one drawback. It was not completely resistant to water. Then larch came into play. Larch wood contains special resins that not only protect it from rotting, but also make it even stronger over time. When in water, without oxygen, larch does not rot, but petrifies, becoming hard as stone. It turned into an eternal foundation. And so, thousands and thousands of logs began to be floated down the mountain rivers and then down the sea into the lagoon. It was a whole forest on the water, floating to its destination. Each log, each trunk, was not just a building material. It was the future foundation, the heart of the city, which was supposed to beat in time with the waves. The Venetians realized that to create their city, they didn't have to fight nature. They had to become part of it. And so they chose the larch to forever link their fate with water, making it their main ally. The idea was brilliant, but its implementation required incredible logistics. The alpine forests, rich in larch and oak, were far from the lagoon. To deliver thousands and thousands of logs, the Venetians had to make their own way. It was a real adventure, tens, if not hundreds of kilometers long. The logs were cut in the mountains and then dumped into mountain rivers, which carried them down to the plains. It was dangerous and hard work. Workers called floaters floated the logs by standing on them, controlling long poles. Their skill was akin to circus art. They had to avoid rapids, rocks, and shallows so that the valuable cargo would not be lost along the way. On the plains, the logs were collected into huge rafts. These rafts were so massive that you could walk on them as if they were on land. They were like floating islands of wood. These rafts were then sent to the mouth of the Brenta River, which flows into the Adriatic Sea right across from the Venetian lagoon. The sea part of the journey was no less difficult. The rafts were towed, often with the help of rowboats. Wind, storms, strong currents, all this threatened the valuable cargo. But the Venetians stubbornly continued their work. For them, each log was not just a tree. It was part of the future city, part of their new home. It was this process, repeated over the centuries, that made Venice what we know it as. Thanks to this alloy that connected the mountain forests with the sea lagoon, a city arose that seemed to have no right to exist. It was built not only of stone, but also of wood, which traveled a long way to become the invisible but reliable heart of Venice. And so, when thousands of logs had been delivered to the lagoon, the hardest and longest stage began, driving the piles. It was not a quick or easy process. It was a labor that lasted for decades, requiring incredible strength, endurance, and, most importantly, coordination. Each log, now a pile, was a real treasure. It had to be installed vertically and driven into the muddy bottom to a depth of 2 to 10 meters. This was done not with the help of machines, but exclusively by hand. The workers used heavy wooden hammers, which they raised on ropes. The blows were rhythmic and powerful. To work in unison, the builders sang. Their songs weren't just for fun. They were a way to synchronize their efforts. One person would start a song, setting the tempo, and the others would follow. Each verse could correspond to one hammer blow, and so, with song and rhythm, thousands of piles sank into the mud. The work was excruciatingly hard, but it was filled with meaning and a collective spirit. Each blow brought them closer to creating a city. This entire process was invisible to ordinary people. It was hidden under the water, in the mud, where the wood gradually petrified, becoming stronger than any stone. The workers knew that their labor would remain invisible to future generations, but this was precisely what gave them strength. They were not just building houses, they were building eternity. Each blow of the hammer was a blow to despair, affirming their belief that their city would stand forever. According to legend, about 1 million such piles were needed for the Rialto Island alone. And for the Church of Santa Maria della Salute alone, built in the 16th century, more than 1 million large piles were driven. These figures are astounding and show the enormous amount of work that went into the invisible foundations of Venice. Manual labor was the basis of construction, but even in those distant times, people sought to make their work easier. Thus, the first simple mechanisms appeared that helped to drive piles into the muddy bottom. Of course, these were not modern pile drivers, but rather ingenious inventions in their simplicity. One such machine was a large wooden hammer that was raised using winches and ropes. Several people would pull on the rope, raising the hammer to a certain height and then release it. Under the influence of gravity, the hammer would fall with a roar onto the pile, driving it deeper into the mud. This process was much more efficient than simply hammering by hand and allowed piles to be driven faster and deeper. Another important invention was the so-called pendulum pile driver. It consisted of two tall wooden posts, between which a heavy hammer was suspended by a rope. Workers swung the hammer like a pendulum and hit the pile with force. This allowed for more precise and powerful blows. These primitive but effective technologies were a real breakthrough. They allowed the Venetians to move from building individual huts to erecting entire neighborhoods. Workers could drive piles over a large area, creating a single, reliable platform for future buildings. In addition, the Venetians figured out how to combat the fact that the piles eventually come to the surface. They used special wooden rings that were put on the pile and prevented it from splitting when struck. This allowed them to be driven even deeper and stronger. It is these small but important details and technologies born out of necessity that allowed Venice to grow from a few islands into one of the most majestic cities in the world. These machines, driven by human strength and ingenuity, have become a true symbol of the ingenuity and tenacity that led to the creation of a miracle on water. When thousands of piles were driven into the muddy bottom, they formed a kind of underwater forest. This forest of wood, which over time became as hard as stone, could not yet serve as a reliable foundation for buildings. The next step in this incredible engineering process was to create a solid platform on top of the piles. Once the piles had been driven to the desired depth, their tops were cut off at the same level, just below the surface of the water. This huge wooden canvas was then covered with a thick layer of stone. This layer consisted of large stone slabs tightly packed together. The stones did not simply lie on the piles, they were connected to each other with a special mortar that the Venetians made from lime, sand, and small brick fragments. This mortar was so strong that over time it turned into a monolithic waterproof slab. The stone platform played several important roles at once. Firstly, it evenly distributed the weight of the future buildings over the entire area of the piles. This prevented individual sections from sagging. Secondly, it served as reliable waterproofing, protecting the wooden foundation from exposure to air. Without oxygen, the wood did not rot, but remained in perfect condition for centuries.
Située au milieu d'une lagune, Venise était particulièrement protégée par la nature elle-même. Son terrain marécageux, ses eaux peu profondes et ses canaux enchevêtrés la rendaient quasiment imprenable aux armées terrestres et aux grands navires. Aucune armée ne pouvait approcher de ses remparts, et une flotte ennemie pouvait facilement s'échouer ou se perdre dans le labyrinthe de canaux. Cette défense naturelle devint le principal allié de Venise tout au long de son histoire. Cependant, la protection naturelle n'était pas la seule. Les Vénitiens, comme nul autre, comprenaient l'importance de la puissance maritime. Ils construisirent une puissante flotte qui non seulement contrôlait les routes commerciaux, mais protégeait également la ville des pirates et des flottes ennemies. Le cœur de cette puissance était l'arsenal, un gigantesque complexe naval où des dizaines de navires pouvaient être construits simultanément. Son efficacité était telle que, selon la légende, les Vénitiens pouvaient lancer un nouveau navire en une seule journée. Venise construisit également des fortifications artificielles. Des structures défensives furent érigées autour de la ville et des forteresses se dressèrent aux entrées de la lagune, empêchant l'entrée des navires ennemis. Le système de fortification fut pensé dans les moindres détails. Tours de guet, feux de signalisation, chaînes bloquant les canaux. Tout cela transforma la ville en une forteresse imprenable. Mais la plus grande défense de Venise ne résidait ni dans ses armes ni dans ses remparts. C'était son incroyable résilience et son ingéniosité. Ses habitants apprirent à vivre en harmonie avec l'eau, la transformant d'obstacle en bouclier. Et tandis que d'autres cités tombaient aux mains des barbares et des conquérants, Venise résista, protégée par sa situation géographique, sa marine et surtout sa conviction inébranlable que même l'endroit le plus hostile peut devenir le refuge le plus sûr. This method of construction was revolutionary. It allowed people to build on swamps as if they were solid ground. The Venetians weren't just building walls, they were creating an artificial island on which to build an entire city. This stone slab, invisible to the eye, became the true heart of every Venetian building, its solid foundation, which underlies all the city's greatness. We admire the facades of palaces, glide along the canals in gondolas, and stroll along narrow streets. But the most incredible miracle of Venice has always remained hidden from our eyes. Under every house, under every bridge, under every square, there is a real underwater forest. Millions of wooden piles on which the entire city rests. This is the ghost town, the invisible part of Venice. Deep in the mud, where there is no oxygen, the piles of larch and oak do not rot. Instead, they are soaked in minerals from the seawater and become incredibly hard. This process takes decades, but eventually the wood turns into stone. This underwater foundation, which we do not see, is many times stronger than any modern concrete structure. It is this ghost town that saves Venice from subsidence. Yes, the city is slowly but surely sinking, but it is happening very evenly. Each house, each church, each column rests on its own eternal foundation. Without this invisible forest of logs, Venice would simply drown in the swamps a few years after construction began. And this knowledge adds a special magic to the city. After all, when we look at the majestic St. Mark's Cathedral, we do not see that under it there are hundreds of thousands of piles driven into the bottom 1,000 years ago. When we cross a bridge, we do not think that it is supported by ancient tree trunks that were once brought from the mountains and manually driven into the ground.
The ghost town is not just a foundation. It is a symbol of the faith and willpower of the first Venetians. It is an eternal reminder that the most important and reliable foundations always remain hidden from view. When the solid stone platform was ready, the Venetians faced the following problem: how to organize space. After all, a city built on many separate islands could not exist without connections between them. Instead of the usual streets, they created a unique system that determined the entire appearance of Venice. At first, the canals were just natural channels between marshy islands. But as the city grew, the inhabitants began to deepen them, widen them, and strengthen their banks. They used the same principle as for the foundations of buildings. They drove piles and reinforced them with stone. Thus, the canals became not just waterways, but full-fledged roads along which one could move. The widest and most important of them, the Grand Canal, became the main transport artery of the city. They were architects not only of buildings, but also of water. Every canal, every street, every small bridge, all of it was part of a single, complex labyrinth. The narrow passages between houses, which we call calles, were created for pedestrians, but the main flow of life went by water. Construction materials,
Products and goods from distant countries were transported along the canals. Gondolas, which later became the symbol of Venice, were not just entertainment for tourists, but the main means of transportation. Their special shape, allowing easy maneuvering in narrow canals, was thought out to the smallest detail. Thus, the Venetians turned a disadvantage, the lack of land, into their greatest advantage. They created a city where there are water instead of roads, gondolas instead of cars. A city where every canal is a street leading to new discoveries, and every bridge is not just a crossing, but part of a unique aquatic life. It was a completely new, brilliant concept of urban planning that forever changed the idea of what a city could be.
The canals of Venice are not just waterways. They are a complex and highly organized system that allowed the city to function. Unlike land cities, where the main transport hub was on the main road, in Venice it was on the water. Each canal had its own purpose. There were wide and deep ones, like the Grand Canal, along which large merchant ships sailed, bringing goods from distant lands. There were narrow canals, like veins, called rios, which led to residential areas and workshops. And there were very small channels, known only to local residents. The center of this entire system was the port. It was located in a separate area, the arsenal, where ships were built. It was here that the galleys and caravels that brought Venice wealth and glory were created. Routes connecting the city with the rest of the world diverged from the arsenal. Maintaining this system in working order required enormous efforts. The canals were constantly cleaned, deepened, and their banks were strengthened. Special vessels called burchella were used for this. These were small barges that, with the help of manual labor or horses pulling them along the banks, scooped out silt and sand from the bottom. Everyday logistics were also unique. All cargo, from building materials to food, was delivered by water. Each house facing the canal had its own pier where boats were moored. This created a special rhythm of life, where there is no rumble of carts, but there is the splash of water and the creaking of oars. The canals became Venice's bloodstream, its roads and streets. They shaped not only its appearance, but also its character. The character of a city that always looked towards the sea, to new discoveries and trade routes. A solid foundation and strong walls are only half the battle. For a city to become a home, life had to appear in it. Initially, the houses of the first Venetians were modest, functional buildings. They were 2- or 3-story buildings with a shop or workshop on the ground floor and living quarters above. The ground floor was always built with the possibility of rising waters in mind, so it had almost no windows facing the canal, and the doors were protected from flooding. But as Venice grew in wealth and influence, the houses began to change. Modest buildings gave way to grand palazzos. Venice became a center of trade, where trade routes from the east and west crossed. Merchants, fabulously rich from the trade in spices and silk, sought to show off their wealth. Thus was born the unique Venetian architecture, a mixture of Byzantine, Gothic, and Renaissance styles. Venetian palaces were distinguished by a special architectural element, a loggia, or open gallery on the second floor, from where a view of the canal opened up. These loggias became the calling card of the city. The facades of the buildings facing the water
became the most ceremonial because it was through the canals that guests arrived. Doors facing the canals led directly to the pier where gondolas were moored. The finishing materials became more and more luxurious. The facades were decorated with white Istrian stone, and the windows with fine carvings and colored glass. The courtyards were small but cozy, with wells cisterns that collected rainwater. Each palace was a kind of fortress and at the same time a beautiful, airy work of art, rising above the water. Thus, from small huts in the marshes, a city grew up, full of luxury and beauty. And this story of transformation, from desperate fugitives to the richest merchants, is reflected in every stone and every window of Venice. When the construction emerged from under the water and the visible stage began, the Venetians faced a new challenge. There was no building stone or suitable clay for bricks on the islands. All materials had to be brought from somewhere. And this gave rise to another incredible logistical chain. The main material for construction was Istrian stone. It was mined in quarries on the Istrian Peninsula, which was located on the other side of the Adriatic Sea. Istrian stone was not just beautiful, it was incredibly durable and, most importantly, resistant to salt water. It was used for cladding the lower floors, which were constantly in contact with water, for the construction of embankments and bridges. Delivered by ship, it became the face of Venice, its visible part. The Venetians used bricks to build the walls, but they were also brought in, mainly because of the high mountains that separated the lagoon from the rest of Italy. The bricks were light and strong, and their warm reddish hue added coziness to the city. The mortar was also an important element. The Venetians used a special mixture of lime, sand, and crushed shards of old ceramics, which was resistant to moisture and only gained strength over time. Gradually, a city grew out of these imported materials. Houses and palaces were erected on a solid foundation, with their facades facing the canals becoming the main ones. Architects working in Venice were forced to take into account the peculiarities of the place, the lack of soil, constant humidity, the need for light but strong structures. Therefore, a unique architecture was born here, where every element, from thin columns to carved balconies, was thought out for life on the water. All this created a special above-water world where every stone and every brick was a witness to the incredible power of human will, capable of creating a dream city out of nothing. Venice was a crossroads city where East and West met. This unique geographical position was reflected in its architecture. The first large palaces and churches that began to appear in the city were heavily influenced by the Byzantine style. Byzantine influence came to Venice with merchant ships. Merchants returning from Constantinople brought not only goods but also ideas. Thus, the facades of buildings were decorated with arches, mosaics, and fine stone carvings reminiscent of imperial luxury. One of the most striking examples of this style is St. Mark's Cathedral, which in its appearance and interior decoration resembles Byzantine basilicas. Its golden mosaics and domes became a symbol of the wealth and power of Venice. Over time, in the 13th and 14th centuries, Gothic replaced Byzantine forms. But it was not the heavy, gloomy Gothic that was built in Northern Europe. Venetian Gothic was light, airy, and graceful. It adapted to local conditions, where everything had to be light and stable. Windows became larger, facades became lighter, and balconies and columns became thinner and carved,
reminiscent of lace. Venetian architects masterfully combined these styles. They took from Gothic its vertical lines, pointed arches, and open-work decorations, and from the Byzantine style, symmetry and richness of decoration. Thus was born the unique Venetian Gothic style, which still amazes with its beauty and dissimilarity to everything else. The most striking example of this style is the Doge's Palace, with its light, almost weightless arcade which seemed to float above the water.
In every palace, in every church in Venice, you can see this history of cultural mixing. It was a city that did not copy, but created. It took the best from different worlds and turned it into something of its own, unique, eternal. Venice was not only a center of trade, but also the cradle of unique crafts. One of the most famous and mysterious was the art of Murano glass. It is not just glass, it is liquid fire, which in the hands of a master turns into a work of art. Initially, glassblowers worked in Venice itself, but in 1291, the Council of Ten, the ruling body of the Republic, issued a strict decree. All furnaces and workshops were moved to a separate island, Murano. The official reason sounded noble, to protect the city from fires. But in reality, this decision had a much more important purpose. On Murano, the masters could be kept under strict control. Their craftsmanship became a state secret. Families of glassblowers were granted privileges. They were allowed to wear swords. Their daughters could marry aristocrats. However, leaving the island without special permission was forbidden. The death penalty was threatened for disclosing secrets or attempting to escape. Murano became a golden cage. Thanks to this isolation, the glassblowers' skills reached unprecedented heights. They learned to create glass of incredible purity and transparency, and invented new techniques, such as creating aventurine glass with glitter or filigree glass with thin threads inside. Each product, from a simple bead to a huge chandelier, was the result of centuries of experience. It was magic contained in glass, and this magic, protected by the state, became one of the main treasures of Venice. Murano glass decorated palaces and temples all over the world, bringing the city not only glory, but also colossal income. And all this became possible thanks to the secret that was kept behind the walls of a small island where fire and sand turned into eternal beauty.
As the city grew, it became full of life. Venice ceased to be a mere refuge and became a bustling, noisy center. Everyday life here was completely different from life in other European cities. Its main feature was that it was inextricably linked with water. In the morning, the city woke up to the cries of gondoliers who were already hurrying about their business, and the creaking of oars. Boats with milkmen, fish and vegetable sellers, bread carriers sailed along the canals. Trade took place right on the water, and buyers came out onto small piers near their houses. Despite the uniqueness of water transport, pedestrian life was also in full swing. The streets, or calle, were narrow and winding, often leading to a dead end or a small square, a campo. These campos were the heart of local neighborhoods. Here were the wells where people came to get water. Here children played. Here they traded and socialized. The most famous campo, of course, was Piazza San Marco, the main center of political and social life. But even the smallest courtyards had their own unique atmosphere. Life in Venice was filled with sounds. The ringing of bells from dozens of churches, the noise of the market on the Rialto, the voices of street vendors, the laughter in the taverns. Unlike other cities, There was no clanking of hooves or rumble of carts. Everything moved quietly, smoothly. The city breathed and lived with its own special rhythm, the rhythm of water that washed the stones, and the rhythm of people who learned to live in complete harmony with this element. Every day in Venice was a small adventure, where at every turn of a narrow street or canal, something new and unknown was revealed. And this feeling of mystery and discovery, which still lives in this city today, was born back then, at the very beginning of its history.
To unite the scattered islands into a single city, the Venetians had to become great bridge builders. Unlike other cities, where bridges were rare, here they became an integral part of everyday life. At first, they were simple wooden platforms without railings that connected the two banks. But over time, they turned into real works of art. The first stone bridges appeared in Venice as early as the 12th century. The most famous, of course, was the Rialto Bridge. Its construction took several centuries and was a real challenge for engineers. The bridge collapsed 3 times until the one we see today was built at the end of the 16th century. The Rialto Bridge is not just a crossing. It is a full-fledged street with shops and stalls where you could buy everything from spices to precious jewelry. Every bridge in Venice is unique. They have no steps because neither horses nor carriages traveled on them. Narrow, often without railings, they created a feeling of airiness and lightness. The Bridge of Sighs, connecting the Doge's palace to the prison, became a symbol of romance and sadness. But for prisoners, it was their last glimpse of freedom before their lives changed forever. In addition to the large bridges, the city had a whole network of small passages connecting houses and courtyards. They were secret paths known only to locals and allowed people to move around the city without crowds on the main streets. These bridges, narrow and often hidden from view, created the feeling of a labyrinth where every turn led to new discoveries. Thus, bridges became not just a part of architecture, but a symbol of unity, linking together the disparate parts of the city. They turned Venice into a single organism where each island was connected to the next, and each step was a small journey over the water. Situated in the middle of a lagoon, Venice was uniquely protected by nature itself. The marshy terrain, shallow waters, and tangled canals made it virtually impregnable to land armies and large ships. No army could approach its walls, and an enemy fleet could easily run aground or get lost in the labyrinth of channels. This natural defense became Venice's main ally throughout its history. However, natural protection was not the only one. The Venetians, like no one else, understood the importance of sea power. They built a powerful fleet that not only controlled trade routes, but also protected the city from pirates and enemy fleets. The center of this power was the arsenal, a gigantic shipbuilding complex where dozens of ships could be built simultaneously. Its work was so efficient that, according to legend, the Venetians could launch a new ship in just one day. Venice also built artificial fortifications. Defensive structures were erected around the city, and fortresses stood at the entrances to the lagoon, preventing enemy ships from entering. The fortification system was thought out to the smallest detail: watchtowers, signal lights, chains blocking the canals. All this turned the city into an impregnable fortress. But Venice's greatest defense was not its weapons or its walls.
It was its incredible resilience and ingenuity. Its inhabitants learned to live in harmony with water, turning it from an obstacle into a shield. And while other cities fell to barbarians and conquerors, Venice stood, protected by its location, its navy, and, most importantly, its unwavering belief that even the harshest place can become the safest home. The history of Venice is the story of a miracle born from despair, where water became not an obstacle but a foundation. But what is happening to this miracle today? For centuries, the city has successfully resisted enemies and the elements, but today it faces new challenges.
Chief among them is aqua alta, or high water. Due to global warming and rising sea levels, the city is increasingly suffering from flooding. Venetians, who have lived in harmony with the water for centuries, are now forced to fight it. Protection projects such as the Meuse barrier system are trying to save the city, but the debate about their effectiveness and cost continues. It is a battle in which man is once again trying to confront nature, but this time with new, not fully understood forces. Another problem is tourism. Venice is visited by over 30 million people every year, several times more than its own population. This flow is destroying the city. The narrow streets cannot withstand such a large number of people, and the canals cannot withstand huge cruise liners. The city, built for a quiet, measured life on the water, was not ready for such an influx. The natives are leaving, giving way to hotels and souvenir shops. Venice today is a city museum, a city monument, but it still lives, breathes, and retains its charm. Under its streets, there is still that same underwater forest of piles that was driven 1,000 years ago. It still holds the city, reminding us of the power of the human spirit, which is capable of creating something eternal. And perhaps the most important lesson Venice teaches us is not its beauty or its wealth, but its fragility. It reminds us that even the greatest creations can be lost if they are not cared for. Its story is not only one of triumph, but also of constant struggle, of a beauty that can disappear if we forget the cost of its creation.